Will begin in 1 minute. The meeting will begin in 1 minute. Thank you.
Okay, I call this meeting to order and welcome to the Land Use Committee meeting Tuesday, September 20th. The first order of business is approval of the minutes. May I have a motion?
Move to approve the minutes.
Second, Selberg.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that passes unanimously. All right, next we have a discussion. First topic of discussion is our tobacco-free project, and Director Franken is going to be first up to address that topic. Welcome, Director Franken.
Very good. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. Again, I'm Jill Franken, Public Health Director for the City of Sioux Falls, and I'm here to provide you an update on a project that's going to have a positive impact on the health of our community. So I've had the pleasure of serving on steering committee, and you can see I have served on this committee along with Don Kearney, Director of Parks and Recreation. And then also our project sponsor is Mary Michaels, and she's a public health coordinator with the Sioux Falls Health Department. And Deborah Gaikowski is our project manager. So I'd like to start by providing you just a little bit of background about tobacco use and the tobacco policies in our community. Tobacco use continues to be the #1 preventable cause of death. I want that to kind of stick with you, and we'll be talking more about that as Mary presents some information to you. We saw tobacco use as an identified health concern in both our 2012 as well as our 2016 Community Health Needs Assessment. And since 2012, reducing tobacco use has been a public health priority in our Live Well Sioux Falls Community Health Plan. The focus of public health is to protect the well-being and the health of our residents of the City of Sioux Falls. And municipalities, therefore you as a City Council, do have the authority to adopt policies to protect and promote the health, safety, and welfare of our residents. In the area of policy, there has been an ordinance in place since 1995 that prohibits tobacco use in city buildings. And as a result of our first Community Health Needs Assessment in 2012, we worked with Park and Recreation on a policy that was implemented in 2013. And to talk a little bit more about that and how well that's been going for this community, I welcome Don to come forward.
Good afternoon, councilors.
Welcome, Director.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be part of this project. As Jill mentioned, we did look at tobacco use in our community as well as what was happening in other communities, and we felt we had an opportunity to impact the health of our kids through tobacco-free parks policy. So the youth recreation policy was adopted by the Parks and Recreation Board as well as endorsed by the Board of Health in 2013. And really what that does is it regulates tobacco and the use of tobacco in areas around playgrounds and any youth activities being less than 18 years of age. So think about youth softball tournaments, youth baseball programs, youth soccer programs, anywhere we would have youth recreation as the primary function. We've had really good success with this policy, and it's really just relied on self-compliance. It's relied on education. And I don't believe to this day, since it was adopted back in 2013, that we've issued any citations or had anybody really not comply when they were asked to, are you aware of the policy, that we have on youth recreation within our park system. So we've had great self-compliance. We did a lot in the areas of signage. We also did quite a bit in area education around this particular policy, and again, it's really not had any enforcement issues around the policy itself. The other thing that we did hear when we adopted the policy is that a lot of the youth recreation programs, South Dakota Junior Football, Sioux Empire Baseball, a lot of those different organizations are very supportive because it reinforces the policies that they too had in place, and it was just a consistent message between those youth recreation providers. So building on that positive momentum from that original policy, we began to explore with the project team steps in further reducing tobacco use in our community, and looking at what was appropriate within our authority as a city to focus on creating a healthier environment. So with that, I'd now turn it over to Mary Michaels with Health. Mary?
Thank you, Don, and good afternoon, council members. Mary Michaels with the Sioux Falls Health Department. And we look at tobacco policy. It's been more than 50 years ago since the U.S. Surgeon General first issued a report that linked smoking to serious health impacts such as cancer and heart disease. That office released a follow-up report in 2006, issuing the statement that there is no safe level of exposure to secondhand smoke. And just last week, the American Heart Association issued a statement basically setting forth a zero tolerance policy when it comes to secondhand smoke because of the health impact. So this map that you see on this slide shows both city and county policies that regulate tobacco use. So you can see it's widespread across the country. More than 1,200 municipalities regulate the use of tobacco. In South Dakota, we know that our state plays a large role in tobacco regulation, tobacco prevention, through things such as the current indoor clean air law regulating tobacco taxes. So they do play that large role in that tobacco prevention and promotion. And it's worth mentioning that when that state indoor air law passed, it passed with 65% voter support. In a poll that was conducted in 2013 by the American Cancer Society and American Heart Association, that support had grown to 85%. So not only does evidence and science support tobacco-free environments, people support tobacco-free environments as well. So at the local level, we are able to regulate tobacco use on municipal property. And so as we began to research policy options for Sioux Falls, we did look at many of these communities to see the approach that they took to determine what might be appropriate for our community. So this is just a little bit of a zeroed-in focus on some communities that are more kind of in that middle part of the country. We did look at policies in the larger cities, but we also tried to look at policies that were in cities more of our size. And we found that they were regulating tobacco use on properties such as parks and outdoor spaces that were under the authority of the city in order to provide that healthy environment. So that is places like parks, sports complexes, and outdoor venues. So our project components had several key points. The first one is ultimately to promote the health of our community. I want to share just a few numbers with you that really point to the science and the evidence behind these policies. Smoking and exposure to secondhand smoke are responsible for 480,000 deaths a year in our country. In South Dakota, smoking causes approximately 1,100 deaths per year. That's nearly 3 every day. For every person who dies from tobacco use, there are 30 more who suffer with at least one serious tobacco-related illness. Smoking costs South Dakota alone $373 million in health expenditures and another $233 million in lost productivity. So there's a state and federal tax burden on each of our residents of our state due to these tobacco-related illnesses, and that is $587 per household. So when we look at tobacco, there's health costs and there are real economic costs associated with it. And we think about our youth and current trends. If our current trends continue with tobacco use, there are 21,000 South Dakota children alive today who will die prematurely because of tobacco illness. Tobacco causes diseases. So for these and many other evidence-based reasons, we did begin to review model policies and best practices from other communities, ensuring that we were defining the scope of the policy as it applies to any city property. And we have engaged many stakeholders in this process. We know that there are a number of people who use our city facilities, our city parks. And so we have talked with groups like SMG, the management group at the Convention Center, Arena Event Center. We've talked with major event organizers such as Harley Nights, Jazz Fest, and so those conversations with these stakeholders in their community are continuing. To talk specifically about what some of the components are in the proposed ordinance, we did define the property. So there are some examples for you there, but it would include things like the parks, the zoo, event center, arena, convention center, golf courses, and it would include those parking lots and those adjacent areas to city property. And the proposal includes all tobacco products, including electronic devices, because this is an emerging public health issue, and there's more science showing the negative health impacts of electronic products as well. We also talked about enforcement. We're looking at how other communities were addressing enforcement. And as Don alluded to, our current policy is working very well. And that's because we have relied on signage and education and awareness. And when you provide that to the community, people are generally very responsive, very respectful of the policy. And so we would approach this in the same manner with widespread community education, awareness, signage on the properties to make sure people understood where this policy does apply. Tobacco prevention messaging has already been a component of the work of Live Well Sioux Falls over the last few years, making sure that people know that there are resources available to them like the South Dakota Quit Line. But because this is an ordinance, it would have that authority for law enforcement to issue a citation. But again, just as with our current policy, enforcement has really not been an issue, and we would really rely on that education and awareness with the community. So tobacco prevention policies result in many benefits, not only to the individual with their health, but also to the community as a whole. There's a benefit to the physical environment. We know that cigarette litter is the #1 littered item. And not only does this present a danger to children and animals in our parks and other places that can ingest these materials, if they are discarded on streets, on sidewalks where they can end up in storm drains, they can leach toxins into the water. So other communities that have been enforcing these policies have seen improvements to their physical environment as well as to the health and well-being of their community. So when you remove tobacco from the environment, it supports those who have already quit or who are trying to quit. And it also provides that role modeling that can hopefully prevent youth from ever starting to use tobacco. So to reiterate the purpose of this policy, it really is as much for those who use tobacco as those who do not. Tobacco users on average die 10 years earlier than those who do not. And the goal is to protect public health, which means to explore those opportunities where we can extend these health protections to everyone. In terms of the timeline, we are here today and we will continue our conversations with stakeholders in the community through the fall. And we will continue working with them, explaining the policy, making sure that they have all the information and resources that they would need to move forward and with their events and things that might happen, rec leagues for next year. But then our plan would be to bring this to the full council also later this fall. We are pleased that several organizations have already pledged support to this policy, and they see the benefits that this has to our community, and we look forward to more conversations in the coming weeks. Now I'd like to welcome Jill back.
You know, as we wrap up this presentation, as you can well imagine, it is the responsibility that I hold as a public health director to recommend policy, to recommend initiatives that can improve the health of our community. You know, I'd love to say that we're blazing trails by recommending this policy for reducing tobacco on all city properties. But as you heard, we aren't necessarily leading the way, but we have great examples of how other communities have done this work and been highly successful. You know, public policy to reduce tobacco use has and decrease tobacco exposure has been successfully legislated in a number of ways when you look at it. Tobacco tax, age requirements, product warnings, tobacco-free indoor spaces, and tobacco-free outdoor spaces, such as what we've implemented thus far, are ways that we've been able to have an impact on tobacco use in Sioux Falls and across the nation. Yeah, I want to just paint a picture for you. Think about what it was like when you went into a restaurant before we had tobacco-free spaces. Just think about that. And think about the effort that it took to make that policy change at the state level. And think about now what you enjoy of breathing in clean air and having a much more enjoyable experience when you're out in the public in those indoor spaces. This policy, we recommend to you, will hopefully serve that same purpose now in our outdoor spaces where we have the ability and can legislate and recommend that you can legislate through policy that we recommend to reduce tobacco use in our outdoor public spaces and all city property. I urge your support of this policy, and as Mary indicated, we'll be requesting an opportunity to present at an upcoming informational meeting. And with that, Don and I are here to answer any of your questions and make any further comments that you might need. Thank you.
Any questions from the committee members? Councilor Staley.
I have a question about sidewalks, whether it be my sidewalk in front of my home or a sidewalk in front of a restaurant downtown. How would that be affected?
What we have indicated in is it's any sidewalks that are adjacent to the city property. So for example, McKinnon Park, the sidewalk adjacent to the park property and then also along to the street level, to the curb, would be property that would be tobacco-free.
But aren't our residential sidewalks city-owned as well?
They are, this might be technically what I need to say, but they are city-owned. No, they're not city-owned. Yeah, I need Dave to come up here, I'm sorry. He can speak in the right legal terms.
Dave Fifley with the City Attorney's Office, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely.
Sidewalks across the city are generally what you would call a public easement, where the public has a right of being able to use that sidewalk. And an individual property owner owns not only, obviously, their property as we envision it, but also the sidewalk that is abutting or right next to their property, as well as the public parking strip and even out to the middle of the curb. There was a case, Fournier versus City of Belle Fourche, decided by the South Dakota Supreme Court that decided that. What this ordinance proposal will do is any property that is city-owned that has obviously a sidewalk abutting to it and the parking strip, all of that would be covered as city property. So I hope that answers your question.
So you are saying it affects the residential city property?
Not
when you
at
say
all,
parking
Councilor.
strip?
No.
So you're not talking about a residential parking strip?
No. So the sidewalk in front of your house is your property. There's a public easement for the public to use that sidewalk that you own in front of your property, but it is not something that would be affected by this ordinance.
And any
at all.
downtown restaurants affected?
No,
Okay, you can
no,
still
Counselor,
smoke.
no. Only city properties, sidewalks, parking strips abutting city-owned property only.
Councilor Neitzer.
So if I'm in front of the Washington Pavilion or the Orpheum, it's in effect. If I'm in front of a private business, it's not.
Correct.
That's pretty much it. Okay. I have a number of questions, perhaps, so I'll just do maybe one or two at a time and then defer so I don't monopolize. The golf courses, has there been discussions as to, I've heard some commentary from, I've already had a few emails about this. What's the policy now, and is there concern about losing customers if it's not allowed?
Yeah, the policy that we currently have that's in place right now does not apply to the golf courses. You know, it is, you know, there may be people that choose not to use the city golf courses as a result of their desire to use tobacco products at that location. So we realize that that could potentially have an impact.
Okay, so it would not be allowed on the course anymore, but it is now.
Correct, because the courses would be city property. Sure. It would apply.
Okay. Well, was there any thought to something that maybe wasn't so wide-ranging, essentially just ratifying the current policy you have now? Because right now it really has no teeth, I don't think. I don't think it's an ordinance, you know what I mean, that I don't know that you could, I thought it was a policy that we have now, but it's not really an ordinance.
It is currently, the Parks Board approved the policy for tobacco-free youth recreation. And so, correct, it's not a city ordinance at this time. When we look at ways that we can impact tobacco use, we do have the authority to do so on city-owned property. Property that we own, we can make those decisions and create those policies. When you look at the opportunity then for us to maximize how we reduce tobacco use in our community, this is a recommendation that we are bringing forward to you as a city council. This is our best recommendation to reduce tobacco use. There is no good outcome for using tobacco. It does not have a good, and it is a public health threat, and it is a physical health threat to the community. So making this recommendation as fully as we are is really taking that best approach that we can recommend to you.
And if I can just continue with one more.
Yes.
Is that okay? Well, and just to be really clear, I've never used tobacco. I don't use tobacco. It's, you know, I don't like it. But I kind of worry, are we protecting people from others? Or are we trying to protect people from themselves? I mean, people do make bad choices. I wish people didn't smoke, but they do. So I struggle with that. But
when you have public health issues such as tobacco use, it does impact us as a community. The cost of health care for treating lung disease caused by tobacco use, treating cancer, treating someone at end of life, that does have an impact on us. And so it isn't that they're just hurting themselves. They are indirectly having an impact on us. The secondhand smoke has an impact. And as we heard from Mary, there really is no safe level of secondhand smoke. You know, I've been in our parks where it hasn't been with youth recreation this summer, and I was, you know, present when someone was having a cigarette, and it was perfectly within their right to do so. And I couldn't help but think very soon, because we were working on this plan, that very soon we would be bringing something forward that perhaps by next summer we could have, hopefully in policy through city council approval, something that could minimize that and reduce that tobacco use in our community.
Councilor Staley.
Jill, would you just tell me again what within the park department, is there a certain amount of feet that you have to be away from someone if you're it seemed like I had heard there was some program where you could have a cigarette but you couldn't be close, you had to be so many feet away from someone. Is that the current policy that has been in existence since 2013 is tobacco-free youth recreation. And so it is requiring that you are not using tobacco in the presence of children while they're recreating. So for example, the playgrounds, wherever you have youth leagues, wherever children are playing. So that would be areas where tobacco is not allowed. So if they were playing, like at McKinnon Park, if someone was having a picnic and there were children there, would that play into that?
From a technicality perspective, that would probably be correct, yes. As you know, though, what we've said is that we are trying to take an educational approach and have been highly successful at that, and an awareness approach and a promotion campaign that we feel has been extremely effective. People also are really good at self-promoting this through people that are engaging with each other at the parks, and if someone has a cigarette, someone might say, you know, did you know that we have a policy? And so we do know that people are able to manage it that way as well, just as general citizens, just helping each other out. So,
thank you.
Yes, Councilor Neitzer.
I guess I'll take one more.
Absolutely.
Another concern that has been already related to me, and I have having had Stampede season tickets for many, many years and going to concerts, you'll see during intermissions, there will be people who will make a beeline for the door. They get stamped, they go out the door, and right now they I think they're kind of herded like cattle into one little area that they're allowed to smoke in. And they'll do that, and then they'll come back in. Was there any concern raised that, I mean, I've had a few people already, and I don't know if they're blustering, saying I will never go to an event again at the event center, and has there been any discussion about that?
We have certainly looked thoroughly and extensively at all of the issues or the variables around setting or recommending this policy. And as Mary discussed, we talked to stakeholders or folks who operate and manage the facilities that the city owns. And certainly, that is a consideration, but there are also benefits around, not allowing tobacco to be used. For example, you do then have less people trying to leave the facility and security issues with them trying to come back in. So there are some benefits that are sort of that unintended benefits side of this tobacco policy as well. So.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Seeing no more questions, I would just, the policy support, once again, just to kind of summarize a little bit, the Board of Health is on board supporting this initiative, Parks and Recreation Board, local event organizers like the Jazz Fest. And has there been any discussion with individuals that will be involved with the Levitt Pavilion in the near future?
Not directly with the Levitt Pavilion representatives. Obviously, we're in regular communication with them, but we kind of started with the big ones that we knew about, with Hot Harley Nights being in that same location where the Levitt Pavilion will be at, as well as Jazz Fest being huge crowds that they really trying to address those two up front. And obviously, we'll be working with more stakeholders between now and this coming fall to continue to reach out there. But we try to hit the big 4 or 5 we felt like would probably be most impacted. And another group that we did mention or did meet with was the Adult Men's Softball Association, where we thought we probably had to touch base with them as well. But certainly there are other stakeholders out there that may want to touch base as well. But as specifically Levitt Pavilion, no, we have not talked to them.
Okay, great. Thank you for that additional information. And then other health organizations like the American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, Health Connect, Set Free Coalition, those are other health organizations that are all on board. Yes. Well, smoking, tobacco products and smoking, we know that it's the #1 preventable cause of death in the U.S. And so the Land Use Committee is probably a good place to start this discussion. And so having said that, your recommendation is informational meeting in late November. And can we pick that date based on our informational load, or do you have the 3rd week or 4th week of November in mind? Any particular?
If I might, could we leave it somewhat flexible, because depending on how easily we're able to work through our next steps and quickly, like meeting with additional stakeholders, et cetera, we kind of allowed ourselves enough time. But if we were able to come earlier, we might request something even closer to the end of October, possibly. But sure. That's a little bit. The end of November would be at the latest.
With a potential first reading in December, then?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Before asking for a motion, Councilor Selberg, did you have a comment?
I just had a quick statement. I appreciate the report. Thank you very much. I mean, it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I lost my father to lung cancer. I certainly know about the dangers of smoking. I've been around it since I can remember. It's tough where I've always been obviously backing the tobacco ban indoors. There's obviously studies, secondhand smoke, we know about that. The tough part you get when you start trying to police the outside use of things, I think sometimes gets a little tricky. I mean, I certainly agree with where we're at now, playgrounds, city parks around children, we get that type of thing. I think the only thing it gets a little kind of what's the fine line, golf courses, you know, that type thing. We're going to not have smoking yet around places. It's still alcohol. I'm already starting to hear some of that type stuff. So I think it's a great report. I think it makes complete sense. I think what we're going to have to work out here in the next few months are some of the, hear what people have to say a little bit and go from there. But I don't know. I didn't really have a question, just my statement, because like I say, I've lived around it forever. I get what you're doing, and thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And it was pointed out to me, too, by Assistant City Clerk Denise, that before coming to the council, the dates that I mentioned, that's council-related meetings, you would have your stakeholder engagements yet continuing September through November as well. So I just wanted to make sure that I pointed that out. So having said that, would a committee member make a motion to bring this to an informational presentation? And we'll just state late November, but we'll remain flexible. So I don't think you need to name a specific date. Anybody would like to make that motion?
I'll make the motion.
Second.
Okay. So the motion has been made to move this forward to informational presentation somewhere in the vicinity of late November. Voice vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Okay, motion passes unanimously. Okay, very good. Thank you very much for the report. All right, our next item is Sioux Falls Ice and Recreation Center property future use discussion. And I would like to invite our very own Councilor Pat Starr to the podium to start this discussion off.
Good afternoon. I want to make sure I do this correctly. I haven't done it from this side for a while. So, Pat Starr, City Councilor from the Northeast District. This is it's a nice place to view the council, and thank you for taking a few minutes to listen to this proposal. This evening, I'd like to talk a little bit about my first few weeks on the council. Those first few weeks were very busy, and one of the things that we did is I received a sheet from Dave Bixler, our budget analyst, that had a list of the outside agencies that the city's funded. Those of us in the new group of counselors spent a varying amount of time touring and visiting with a lot of these agencies. I know that I went to the Compass Center, Children's Inn, the Glory House, the Bishop Dudley Hospitality House. One of the most interesting places for acronyms is the Southeastern Council of Governments, or CCOG, have to call it that. And then we also spent some time talking about affordable housing and the different affordable housing groups in the area. The theme that we kept hearing about over and over was how the state of South Dakota in the last couple of years is releasing more nonviolent, non-threatening type of individuals early into the Sioux Falls community, and how it's taxing these agencies to the brink. Many of the people that have been released early have been able to turn their lives around. They've received kindness and mercy from those agencies and the Sioux Falls community in general. Many of these people were able to find help. They're able to find jobs. In fact, my friend Dave Johnson from the Glory House reported to us that over 80% of the people in his program have jobs. Think about that for just a minute. These are people who've been just released from prison, and our business community has stepped forward to allow these people to find jobs and turn their lives around. The catch is the availability of affordable housing for people with a criminal record. So the circle starts. People are released from prison, they turn their lives around or attempt to turn their lives around, they receive thousands of dollars in counseling, and they're able to reunite with family and work their program. When it's time to leave, they struggle to find housing. They end up in a shelter, a couch at a friend's house, or on the street. It becomes difficult to get to work, that pride of that you're trying to do everything right, and then they end up losing their jobs and back to the way that they got in trouble in the first place. What I noticed was the only way to break this circle was to find affordable housing. Shelters like the Bishop Dudley House is intended for short-term help. They're busting at the seams and are at or over capacity every night. Again, as part of the touring, I was told that the Glory House was trying to expand. They wanted to provide affordable housing for people who have completed their program successfully. They also wanted to continue have services available so that these people could succeed. They wanted a location as part of the expansion that allows for AA that's in the near vicinity, things like Narcotics Anonymous, or the full gambit of services within walking distance or actually on site. That brought me to the point, where do you locate this type of service? I'm not sure what neighborhood would be welcoming in Sioux Falls. I look around Sioux Falls and I challenge you to find a site that has access to jobs, public transportation that's close to those jobs, and all of the services a person needs to turn their life around. That's why my friend Dave and his staff wanted to expand their current site. The Ice and Rec Center is adjacent right next door to their current place. It's zoned correctly for this type of facility that they would like to build, one that offers affordable housing and counseling services, access to jobs and public transportation. As many people have said, it makes sense. My goal today is to determine if the city has a need for the Ice and Rec property, to also decide what's the best use for this property moving forward, and if we determine that the property is surplus, what is the best way to benefit the community? There are other individuals, businesses, and nonprofits that are also interested in this property that could provide services to the community as well. And that's part of our decision-making process, to do that fairly and openly and be able to listen to those proposals. And if nothing else, to find a way and encourage a way to provide access to affordable housing for people who have a criminal record but are trying to turn their lives around. What I've done today is I've invited Director Don Carney from the Parks and Rec Department. Director Tracy Turbeck is also here from the Finance Department to discuss the city's future needs for the Ice and Rec property. I've also invited Dave Johnson, who is the Executive Director of the Glory House. And earlier I had invited Commissioner Jim Schmidt, who is the president of the Glory House Board and also a Lincoln County Commissioner. And I've seen that he's had to leave a little bit early. Also, Danny Brown is here from the City Attorney's Office. He's available to answer any legal questions we may have on the future use of this property. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Did the other individuals that you just named have things that they wanted to specifically say, or they're just available for questions?
I believe they're available for questions, and if you don't mind, in whatever order makes sense, probably makes sense to hear from one of the city directors, and I believe Mr. Johnson has a statement he'd like to make too from the Glory House.
Sure.
Thanks.
Let's go ahead and start with Mr. Johnson then. If you could state your name and...
Good evening. Dave Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the Glory House. Thank you for the opportunity to come here and share some information with you. As was stated previously, I think we can all agree that there's a lot of needs that clients that are coming out of prison are trying to avoid going to prison as an alternative have when they come into our community. We deal with people that have essentially a lifetime of substance abuse, alcohol, struggles with getting work, relationship issues, and they simply are a troubled population. What we try to do is provide them an opportunity to work on all those sort of issues while they're within our current facility. But what we find, as was stated previously, is when they get their ducks in a row and start moving forward, they're having a hard time finding a place to live in our city. We serve about 350 residential clients every year. Out of that 350, about half to 200, 225 stay in our city. They are part of the employment force in Sioux Falls. They are paying taxes while they're in Sioux Falls. But then they try to leave and go outside of the community or outside of Glory House to find a place to live. and it's very difficult for them. They end up in very, very few neighborhoods that people will accept them. So what do? They leave the city, they leave the state. Some go back to what they know, which unfortunately for some folks it means continuing a lifestyle of criminal behavior or alcohol or other substance abuse. And we believe that we can provide an expansion of that continuum of care if we had an opportunity to help them with a place to have long-term housing. It's not that we woke up one day and said, geez, I'd really like to rent an apartment complex. We didn't do that. But what we did see is a need for safe, healthy people that really want to show themselves a place to be where they can get access to services. Our clients, they're, mothers, daughters, sons, brothers of everybody that's probably involved in this room. But where do we help them get a start? We can provide treatment for X amount of days. But if we can provide long-term housing and provide that supportive piece, that's where we'd really like to be. We'd like that opportunity. We think the time is right. With Senate Bill 70 passing a few years ago, we're seeing more and more folks that really need our help. And we're asking at least to be able to be considered as a partner with the city to provide the labor force, taxes, and investment in human capital, because that's really what it's about, at least for us. So with that.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave.
Well,
I think at that, Director Carney has something to say.
Thank you, Don Kearney, Director of Parks and Recreation. I appreciate the opportunity to just provide a little feedback and a little perspective from our department's standpoint anyway. As you all know, we're a growing city, and it seems like we're always looking for more property and facilities to accommodate that growth. We're adding 3,000 to 4,000 people a year, which means more parks, more space, more facilities that we need to be able to deliver those services. For what it's worth, we are currently actually using portions of the building for storage. We have some of the Winter Wonderland's displays, the garlands, some of the product that we put out every year, so we are using it for a portion of that building for storage. The property will likely have significant value over time, and then especially as 49th Street gets extended, it certainly should even go up in value even more when that project happens. And as Councilor Starr referenced, we've had numerous inquiries into this particular property from all walks of life, all different kinds of ideas on how they could potentially use the building. And so typically when you have that level of interest, any disposition of any property is usually a competitive process. But certainly from our perspective, really think it's important to hang on to that property at this time. The other thing, we really don't know what the future holds as the future of ICE goes. Well, we're not intending to reopen that facility as an ICE facility. The equipment's still there. It's still a possibility if there was some need down the road for that particular use. And so I just wanted to share some of those thoughts with you as it relates to the growth of our city and the need for space over time, because we're usually the one acquiring the property. And once you lose it, it's, having to go out and buy it, and the city, them knowing that the city wants the property, obviously that can be difficult at that point too, to get a reasonable price. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Director Turback, do you have anything you would like to add before we open it up to questions for the council?
Thank you, Tracy Turback with the Finance Office. I really don't have a lot to add. I would like to reinforce just a couple points that Don Kearney made. It's no surprise that the city is growing. There's certainly going to be a need for the city to acquire additional property at some point in the future for some purpose. I can't tell you what that will be in the future. And when that happens, it seems the city is perceived as having deep pockets, and we oftentimes pay a premium for property. So I would urge an abundance of caution in disposing of any city property for that reason, because once we let it go, it's gone. When it comes time to acquire property, we do pay typically a high premium once the buyer finds out, or the seller finds out the city is the buyer. The last point I would just reinforce is that if it is determined to be surplus property, that it's clear that there will be no need for this property for city purpose in the future, you won't be surprised that I will be a strong advocate to get the value for the taxpayers out of that property. Don mentioned that it is valuable. I don't think we know today just what the value is, but clearly it's a desirable piece of property for a number of different purposes. And as your finance director, I have a responsibility, as you folks do, to look out for the best interest of the taxpayer. And I would certainly be a strong advocate of that, as Don mentioned, it would be disposed of in a competitive process to maximize the value for the taxpayers and the owners of that property. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not ignoring Assistant Attorney Danny Brown, but I think that we'll move to questions here within the committee. And if any of you have questions specific for Danny, then we can invite him forward. Councilor Staley.
This would probably be for Director Turbeck. And I wanted to say, as he's walking up here, that I was at the first meet and greet we had with Councilor Starr. We came to the Glory House, and I commend you for moving ahead with this project. I'm behind you 100%. I think we do have a need, and we need to service these people. Now, what I'd like to ask is, we just approved the lease for the Elmwood Golf Course for the hotel, and I believe they're going to be paying us some kind of a off the top of the restaurant sales and the hotel sales, correct? Weren't they thinking that was going to be about $40,000 a year?
Yeah, I don't recall exactly. I think that could be in the,
I think,
in the
yeah,
ballpark.
40,000. So would there be a prospect of if they could, and I don't know where you're at with negotiations, but what if they were going to pay you $40,000 a year and lease the land?
Well, again, I think if it's clear that the city, for its own purposes, will not have a use for that property, I think it behooves the city to maximize the value and utilize a competitive process, just like we did in the example that you used, Councilor Staley, the Elmwood Golf Course. There was a competitive process that the city went through, put that out for proposals, and whether it's a lease or whether it's an outright sale, whatever the best method of maximizing the taxpayer value is, it would certainly be something I would advocate for.
But have we ever done something where we've given consideration to a special group for city property to use it or lease it?
I guess
we wouldn't put it out on the marketplace to get the highest bid when we would think there'd be a need to service the city.
I don't know that the city has done that. Nothing comes to my mind at this point.
Councilor Neitzer.
I think you alluded to it. We don't have an appraisal on this property.
I don't believe so, no.
Who would be responsible for, I mean, a big question that I would have is how big is the asset we're talking about disposing of, essentially? How much is the land worth?
And I think that would be a prudent question to get an answer to if once we get to the point where we determine that there is no future need for the city for that property. I mean, it doesn't necessarily serve a lot of purpose to know what it's worth if we intend to keep it.
Okay.
That's my point.
And I assume there's no park use on this. We don't have any legal cloud of, what parks you can't. It doesn't have a park purpose for state law reasons.
Now you're getting into Danny's territory, so I'll let him answer that one.
Okay.
Danny Brown, Assistant City Attorney, you're correct. There's no restrictions on the property. It wasn't given to us or conveyed to us with the park purpose requirement, so we're free to do with it as we wish, pursuant to general state law.
Okay.
Other questions?
Yeah, and if, let's say hypothetically, we were decided to sell it rather than, let's say, gift it, what restrictions are there as far as what a city could do? I mean, can you sell it to somebody for $1, or are there legal restrictions?
Well, that's a good question, and it can be complicated, but generally, if you're going to sell real estate, there's 3 ways you can do it. You can do it by auction, by bid, or you can list it with a licensed real estate broker and sell it that way. If you do it by bid or by auction, then you have to sell it to the highest bidder. So you're limited to who you can sell it. You don't have to sell it, but if you have the auction or the bid and you're going to sell it, it has to be to the person or entity that bids the highest amount. If you don't want to go the bid or the auction route, you can list it with a licensed broker. The city has 2 licensed brokers full-time, so we can do that. The requirement there is you have to sell the property at 90% of appraised value. And the appraisal is done not by a city employee, but by a certified appraiser.
Okay, so at least 90%. So the idea of selling it for $1 or something, that's out, obviously.
There are a few exceptions to that, but to sell it to the Glory House, that option is out.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Councilor Selberg.
Councilor Staley may have asked this and got an answer. If I missed it, I'm sorry, but is there a precedent for this? Has the city ever, do we know, donated something like this to? Apparently we don't know. Okay. Just clear if I missed the answer, if there was one. So.
It looks like you have stumped them.
There we go.
Councilor Neitzer.
Just to loop back around, I understand you'd want to get through the step of deciding that you don't need, you may not have a need for it in the future. But to me, again, I'm big on protecting the taxpayer as well. So I would want to know, what am I essentially, I mean, it's not my property I'd be quote unquote giving away. I mean, I'd essentially be gifting on behalf of the taxpayer to an entity. So it's something that would be a question I'd like to know in the future. So.
Okay. Yes. Councilor Starr.
You make a very good point, Councilor Neitzer. But what I've noticed as part of this process is maybe backing up a little bit, is taking a look at what we purchased the property for. We purchased the property for $100,000, 5 payments of $20,000 each. So in my thought process, that's a definite good way to recoup what the taxpayers put into this. We received a service. We were able to use that facility for 5 years plus to get the value. It was, I would say $100,000 was gifted to the city to do humanitarian purposes. And I think if we determine that it isn't something that we need or it is surplus, that might be some place to start the conversation from. But I do agree that an appraisal process is also part of this. What happens is my understanding from the legal side of it, we're limited by the options, whether the Attorney Brown stated of how we can declare it surplus and sell it, or gifting it to a nonprofit agency. We have that ability in statute as well. So there are multiple options of how to move forward with this. But again, reminding you that we purchased this property at $100,000, provided a humanitarian service by providing ice and hockey and recreation. The other thing that I didn't mention in my earlier comments, if you don't mind to expand a second, is we heard from the Hockey and Ice Association last week pretty clearly that if they chose to expand, at least from a ice perspective, that they were very interested in expanding at the Shields Iceplex for mostly monetary reasons, that an individual sheet of ice is very expensive to operate, and whether we would feel as a council that we're willing to subsidize a separate piece of ice. There may be other park or other type of issues that we could use it for on behalf of the city. The other thing, Director Turback talked a little bit about 49th Street going through and the value of the property increasing significantly. That is going to be significantly delayed. We've pushed it out of our 5-year CIP program, so we'll be moving forward, or we're at least 6 years away from doing that as well. If we truly don't have a need, it doesn't seem a prudent use of a piece of property in that area of town to sit on it in a speculative manner, hoping that it would increase considerably in value. There are other pieces of property if we wanted to become land investors as a city, but that's not necessarily our role.
Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, I do have just a couple. How is the property currently zoned and other surrounding properties in addition to the Glory House? I'm assuming that just hypothetically, if this did through whatever means move to the Glory House, it would not be as big an issue since they're already in existence in the particular area. But what's the current zoning of this property and others adjacent in addition to the Glory House?
Yeah, I currently don't know the answer to that question. That's probably a Mike Cooper question, but we could certainly follow up with the council on that question.
Where is Director Cooper when we need him? Councilor Starr, do you know the answer to that question?
I do know. It is zoned industrial, which would allow, depending on the type of plan, as long as there isn't, say there would be counseling and therapy rooms, and as long as there isn't residential living areas on the first floor, it would allow for them to build, or any group to build on a second, third, multiple story building. So I think that would be their intent at some point to continue the zoning that way. It's a very good question because, again, trying to find another location for a similar agency like the Glory House is very difficult to do in the city that would allow housing for people with a criminal record. So okay. I believe they've stated that it would fit with what they are thinking. One of their earlier proposals, they have been working with Lloyd companies to do some early schematics if that's something that was chosen to do, and that was, I know, something that they had talked about or their board has talked about.
Okay, thank you, Councilor Starr. And I have one more question, and it'll be for Mr. Johnson, and then Councilor Starr, I'll call you back up for I guess a final question. So technically, I have two.
Yes,
Mr. Johnson, what is the immediate need for expansion?
well, the immediate need is pretty dramatic because, like I said, we have so many people that get started, they get stabilized, and then they struggle for maybe 30, 60, 90 days to find a piece of property where someone will rent to them. So we have, at any given point, 10 to 12 people that are trying to find housing. And like I said, we lose so many of them to other communities, or they move out of state because they simply can't find housing in Sioux Falls. So we're talking about anywhere from, at any given time, 10 or 12 people that could easily move into a facility, an apartment complex, long-term housing.
And your existing property does not allow for that type of expansion?
Currently, we do not. We are an 84-bed residential facility. We don't, and that's treatment, though. That's treatment and other things directly related to folks coming directly out of prison.
Can you repeat that number?
84 beds.
84 beds.
Yep.
Okay. And then just as a follow-up, what do you project your needs to be 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20?
Well, we are looking at already the need for more beds coming because of the new Senate Bill 70. We're actually playing with the idea of trying to more or less stay at 84, but try to provide an ongoing continuum care to another anywhere 36 to 48 beds apartment complex, because we know the longer we can keep them engaged in treatment or in sobriety, the better off they're going to be. The success rates show that.
Okay. Dave, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here this afternoon. Councilor Starr, my final question would be to you as to where would you like this to go from this point?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Councilor Kiley. What I would like to see us do next is move forward to is to continue to work with city staff, both finance, planning, and Parks and Rec, to make a recommendation and determine if this property is necessary to hold on to, and get a recommendation from them as well as members of the council, and come back with an informational and a plan sometime in November as well.
Okay, so
late October, November.
Technically, then, we do not need to make a motion to move it to councilors because any
there
of
really
you
isn't.
can bring that to a first reading.
Absolutely.
Yourself and another councilor.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, moving on to open discussion. Any topics for open discussion? Okay, seeing none, this meeting is adjourned.